All right, everyone, welcome back to Comic Talk. And today's topic is energy manipulation. That's pretty much a very common power a lot of heroes have. They said whether it's just like a quick blast of heat vision or they shoot light energy out of them. Um, it seems to be fairly universal. Even the fact that a lot of heroes and villains actually use weapons that might be able to um, do other, say, create various types of energies out of there. They always like seem to have like the death ray out there. They always seem to have like heat and freezing rays depending upon the situation. But there's a lot of weird things that kind of go under into light manipulation. And it kind of depends upon what you're trying to actually do because eh, not every blast is meant for total destruction. I mean, you could actually just reach out with a long stream of light and just touch something or like holding open a door for someone and, and it seems to be a fairly kind of smooth construct, very it's kind of like what they show with various lantern cores. I know it said red might be a bit of an issue, but it seems like a lot of standard green lantern stuff, it's just like a glowing whatever it needs to be. And it seems like you can touch it and not, it said, not anything will really happen to you. It might feel a little warm, but it's not really meant to cause something a bit more destructive. Now, one idea I definitely would say is a bit more destructive would be something like a photon blast, something that is meant to be launched. It doesn't actually have a constant stream behind something. Kind of in Captain Marvel, when she destroyed um, something to basically prove that she, was who she says it was. It was that one actually seemed like a constant swirling of energy, like a bunch of shooting stars, and if she let it loose, it wasn't going to do anything else but be destructive. So, and you know, then again, and there's actually a lot of sources for how people can actually unleash light energy, although it could be a number of things. But they all seem to, I think they operate on the same kind of wavelength in terms of what they're supposed to actually do. And the way I've always kind of seen it is that it's, it's being able to bind any type of light energy together in such a way that maybe it's like spinning so much it creates a gravitational pull. And this is what gives the whole hard light attribute to it that allows it to pick up various other objects, become other shapes. And a lot of people would say, well, that sounds kind of weird. Why said how would it exactly would it work? And I actually said there's actually a compound known as aerogel, which is essentially frozen smoke that is 99%, air, yet it has enough force to lift, said a few hundred times its own body weight while also being fireproof. So whether it's something, regular photons of energy, chi, chakra, said magic, or some type of psionic energy, it's all pretty much coming together in just the right way that it's able to maintain its shape and use for whatever it does. But if you were to simply break the actual stream, it is essentially it dissipates. And even then, if you actually are trying to use it for a specific, actually offensive attacks, you do have to. There's a lot of effort into basically containing the energy in whatever form it's supposed to be. Often it's just a basic orb. So, and then you have to make sure that when you launch it, it maintains its shape for a good while and can actually travel for a good distance before either naturally exploding or hitting a target. Think of it kind of like a bunch of fireworks. I said depending upon what kind of venue um, I said you're at, you could have the ones that basically only go up a few feet, looks fancy, but then you could have one that goes very, very high, said into the sky, and um, eventually will reach a point where it will just burst. And this is this has always been a kind of a weird issue on Dragon Ball, just because some of their blasts have actually destroyed planets and done terrible devastation. So it needs to have some type of natural self-destruct formed. Otherwise, it could destroy, a bunch of random said objects in its path. I mean, sure, there's the natural curvature said of the world that eventually would cause it to naturally would cause things to be dissipated. But if you're actually shooting it at a very specific angle and there's like a mountain in the distance where a lot of people live, you might give them a very close encounter. So, and there definitely can be, not every energy is actually meant to be a carbon copy of each other. A lot of people would seem to think that, color means something when it's produced. Um, it's not always the same thing. I mean, lantern cores naturally are based off of whatever their light source actually is. But you said if one was to actually see an alternate reality where here's just a neutral light that they would use, and it's like, okay, we're going to hold this up by, let's say, in front of a certain type of filter, it just takes on that color. So even something kind of like, a black energy could be the same thing as, all the others. It just absorbs light, it just absorbs, the light around it rather than illuminating everything. So you just never know what you're gonna say get. And while there is essentially some people would have like a dark, kind of dark manipulation as something a little bit separately, because DC villain known as Nightshade, she was actually able to produce like a bunch of spikes that actually kind of maintain themselves, for a while before eventually just kind of breaking apart. Because there is definitely a time limit. Even people said, like when Spider-Man basically swings all over town, eventually his web fluid will just break down on its own. Um, not entirely sure exactly, how exactly that totally works, but maybe there is, natural exposure to air causes it to be broken down, said eventually break down, but you know, um, in Spider-Man: Homecoming says that's going to dissolve it in about 3 hours. So, and yet when he attacked, it said, yeah, it said, I forget what his name, but it's like portrayed by Donald Glover. He was actually in in a parking garage. So if it either naturally just has a chemical breakdown, um, that's one thing, because sometimes smells will dissipate very quickly, and it said, and become other things. I mean, surprisingly, um, when we occasionally get a skunk in our area, and there's a lot of like foggy fog right after the rain, the smell eventually smells like you're like like a raw all beef hot dog. And you wouldn't actually, you're thinking, what exactly is that smell now? And you just wouldn't know exactly what it was. So, and another interesting thing about the time concept, I actually saw it in the animated movie, Young Avengers, where the child of Captain America, had a shield that would produce a light disc that, on occasion, seemed like it could be detached to throw around, and if it didn't come back, it eventually just faded away on its own, because he actually had to hold open a door for a little, and said to escape from a difficult situation, and then it just quickly, dissolved and the door closed, and that was it. And that's always kind of interesting, like if you naturally had that ability to, to make everything, to naturally make things like that. And so, and I've definitely started to understand, what exactly some things like with heat and freezing rays actually are, and it's actually pretty simple. A heat, basically, if anything, if the particles of anything accelerate to a very large amount, let's say by very quickly. They build up a lot of heat, eventually may combust. And the idea is just the fact that, if you're like having a laser pointer that essentially just seems to be on a very high frequency, that's, it's essentially will just burn everything in its path. And actual, lasers can pop balloons and even light, matches on fire. I think they were even able to light candles on it. So that's all it really is. Just the fact that you're in that within anything within that beam. It's you're heating everything up like a magnifying glass, but you actually could see a proper light stream. Kind of like how if you watch like a video of laser tag, like some people playing laser tag, you actually will see a laser coming out of them, so out of the guns, but you won't actually see it if you're right there because our eyes cannot process it. So with freezing rays, the idea is the fact that you're actually slowing everything down, and because of the fact that most of the atmosphere that's around us is actually nitrogen, as they start sticking to each other, that starts to make liquid nitrogen. Uh, And in this case, with all the water vapor in the air, that could definitely be a pretty good reaction. Although you could have something like liquid helium, like you showed in Gotham, that seems to be able to freeze everything very quickly. But the idea is just the fact that if you're talking about something natural, you do need just the fact that all it really is just a blast of light that will freeze anything, um, just because it's so quick. And then again, the concept of actually freezing is quite strange because if you see like a nail said on the or any type of piece of metal, it's technically already frozen. We just associate the fact that it has to be super cold, for water to freeze, and but just the fact that just simply means it's able to just stick to itself enough times instead that it creates some other kind of shape. So it's not really not entirely um, not entirely impossible to just consider things, but not every energy is actually meant to be very safe. Such as like if you can create radioactive blast. I mean, in this case, it said you might be fine because just because for plot armor, but it said the fact that you essentially are able to generate that energy at any given point, and even just the fact of so in theory you do have a higher amount of radiation in you, and while there are some basic radioactive compounds that are used in medical testing, um, that and they may hardly even go out of your body, but something like gamma radiation will essentially needs a lot of lead in order to duplicate. And if you hit a target um, with something, it's going to be radioactive for a while. It's going to interact with the atomic structures of instead of whatever, and will cause some kind of decay, or even just even if it's not so kind of with gamma radiation, it doesn't actually change any of the particles. It's just radioactive, and only really seems to affect organic tissue. Gamma radiation, just kind of sit there. So it's just almost as though when I took chemistry class, we talked about what radiation is, and it's a total release of actually all the energy. But some things would say, okay, if this thing is actually decaying in one direction, it could essentially turn an element into something else. So they always would talk about turning lead into gold. Well, in this case, there could be enough radioactive material to the fact that it causes the number of protons to turn into some instead just lower than that, lower than the original atomic structure of lead, and will become that way. Other times, it may actually cause greater forms of natural decay, such as turning uranium into plutonium. Then again, also neptunium is also a good source of plutonium just because it decays very, very quickly. That's one of the problems with, X-rays in hospitals, and the fact that they just cannot keep enough of the materials to make X-rays, on hand because they don't last that long. And but then again, I said energy is definitely a very interesting kind of concept because you want to know what the source is and how much you can actually hold in your body. Might as well be, because if you actually were to overload, overload something with like an insane, blast of lightning, that is definitely going to be far. It will not be able to contain everything. You overload a wire, it's going to explode. So unless you are meant to actually have a very specific type of energy inside of you, um, you're kind of playing Russian roulette. I mean, if you're talking about like some type of life energy like chi, in theory, is that once it goes into you, it has enough of a sense to realize this is how much we can actually have, but that doesn't mean you're not slowly building up around you like cotton candy. In this case, just you don't actually see the sugar on anything, but when you actually start to get the sticks and the other and start building and building and building up, and if you want, and if, pretty much if it's your own other kind of thing, you just redip everything, and it goes right there. And so, I mean, in this case, even if you were to say, well, if you kind of condense, a huge thing of cotton candy, just fit all in your mouth for like speed eating, would that be any different um, than just basically eating, all the sugar out at once? And there's way too much lore for everything to be fully manifested. But there are still some interesting things that can be done, such as the fact that a lot of characters that manipulate energy seem to be able to fly, mostly in just the fact that they produce enough energy to give them lift. And in theory, is the fact that they may not be putting out so much energy to constantly keep them flying at a certain height. That's just the fact that you are just keeping, lift instead pushing, instead you're just using the lifting force to keep you up at a certain point, but then you can kind of calm down and just kind of instead of float in the air, without much, just the idea is the fact that all that kind of force, is what pushes you, kind of like with a balloon, instead of letting go of a balloon. In this case, it's still the same kind of force, but with the right kind of conditions, a balloon could actually rise up, pretty high before falling back down. And that's always kind of an interesting kind of concept because some characters often show they produce like jets out of their. You see actual visible jets, like if you're on fire, like the Human Torch, or even firebenders. You do see that energy. Instead, do see all that power is beneath them, and yet and other characters can just kind of float around like it's nothing. Um, because that's just what they do. And so it's kind of what shows that there's more of an active usage of energy rather than more of a passive. Because some powers might just be easier to produce everything. I mean, like with Static Shock from the DC universe, in order for him to actually fly, he actually has to ride on a disc, almost as though he's essentially making the disc fly, and he's able to stick onto the disc rather than creating a cosmic stream of lightning constantly around like Electro. Although it was implied that he was able to do something kind of similar in his later years, because he was still learning. So everything can definitely change, and yeah, and they're definitely said. I will talk about other forms of said energy. The next video will be actually on psychic powers, and then I will eventually go into magic, because that is a very serious, territory, to explore. Uh, but and But one energy that actually could be very helpful for a lot of people is healing energy. Um, not everyone needs, you said, would be able to heal like Wolverine or any other undead character. Even if they do have, some limited degree of power that allows them to heal, it's kind of like casting a really good healing spell on in a video game. I said that keeps you going because maybe you literally were taken, just on the very verge of defeat, and then someone conveniently heals you like nothing ever happened. Although you don't want to, said you don't want to make people too reliant on that, so it's almost as though, okay, this power will slowly regenerate your energy over time. So as long as the battle keeps going, you'll be fine. Because maybe some characters can absorb energy, like essentially Sebastian Shaw from X-Men First Class. It's if he absorbs more energy, he can actually use it to either restore his youth, be completely healed. But if he's like essentially totally tapped out of energy, or maybe has been in prison for so long with the power dampener, you know, and he's just said he's just totally spent. He would need something over time instead to help him. Although I would not give him actual healing energy because someone like him uses harmful energy to make himself to heal himself. So almost like he's reversing the actual energy as well, instead naturally reversing the energy flow. So a helpful energy will actually be quite harmful, just as um, some video games where you can actually use healing magic to damage undead characters. Um, just in this case, it's just the wrong kind of magic for them to handle. Although sometimes you don't, instead enemies will just kind of be defeated rather than like falling over, just like they were somehow cleansed of the binding process and they vanish in whatever capacity the game actually has. So yeah, definitely would say, but then again, another interesting kind of concept with energy is the ability to perceive actual energy around you. So anyone who's ever seen Dragon Ball or various other Japanese shows know that they can actually detect power levels, which in this case was is kind of the most random of things because not every character may actually have a huge power level, but can still be quite dangerous. I mean, you could just be a pure super strength character, definitely capable of lifting 100 tons, but it may not be the same thing as someone that is actually a super speed character, where every part of their body is meant to be accelerated at a moment's notice. So that could always definitely be an issue, and especially in the fact that there may be a range to actually show how far anything actually is. Because when Raditz first came to Earth and he detected Goku, said on Master Roshi's Island, he says like, "Wow, that's on the very edge of my scouter." And the only thing I could probably think is just the fact that because maybe Master Roshi and Krillin were near Goku, their their collective power was up there. So you want to be able to make sure you can determine what kind of energy you're actually looking for. The last thing you want to do is be so deathly afraid of of finding a really overpowered character, but then you realize, oh, this is just a series of very small characters in a very confined space, and there's not really not too much. But then again, another moment in Dragon Ball that kind of proves why things are definitely unique is when the final battle against Cell, Go said Cell and Gohan were blasting each other with insane amounts of energy, while the other Z fighters were trying to pin Cell down, and yet no one detected seems to make mention of detecting it even once. Even when like all the Cell Juniors that seem to be pretty powerful on their own were also on a rampage, they weren't really going very far from each other in the main action. And yet, in this case, when they talked about when Goku went Super Saiyan 3, the Supreme Kai was actually, it said Supreme Kai and company was actually able to detect his power level like it was only just a few miles away. He said maybe in this case the actual dissipation might be something, but just even the blast from the final Kamehameha wave was more should have been able to be detected by someone. But you would, but then again, there are definitely other ways of perceiving things around you. I mean, some people would say, okay, I can see your aura, which is okay, but the question is, is that what would actually happen if someone was to act and say, may not always like, see that because some people would say, oh, look at this amazing aura, around this dog, but it may not really be much of anything, you know, especially if it's just like one solid color. It's not like a rainbow projection, like it's almost as though like the holograms from Yu-Gi-Oh! Essentially, when they had like the big stadiums and stuff like that, and they had the projectors, you know, lots of multicolored things, but sometimes you can see, someone and say, "Oh, you have a lovely blue aura," and yet, you're saying, "No, mine's actually green." So you never know who's, BSing you or not. But other things that could definitely be perceived under the right set of circumstances involve like various types of cameras. I mean, you have thermal vision that would give you would show everything based off the heat. Um, you know, it's one thing for something to actually be very hot on its own, and you're right near it, so you're thinking, yeah, it's going to be hot. But if you were to see, look across, a very large valley looking for, potentially dangerous animals, they would give off a lot more heat. But it seems like the farther you kind of go out, the less clear it goes. Because I've seen a lot of shows where they show people being said up close, and you can see details on their faces, and yet they just go out, a bit of a distance, and the resolution is terrible. Like someone, took like something that was only like 36, I said 360 pixels, and tried to turn it into 720 pixels, and it didn't exactly work. And then, but in this case, certain versions of infrared cameras could, you know, are it said cannot be seen by other things and is very clear, but it's black and white, or pretty much as total gray things. So it's one thing to be able to see the world at night very clearly, but if you're trying to find something, you know, as I said, you may not really get anything. And um, and even though I've actually seen some types of like a hybrid between the two, where if something is, can still see everything in gray, but if something's really, really hot, it will show up as red, but it may not be as clear of everything. Like there's some kind of trade-off. And then, there are definitely some interesting night vision goggles. Originally it was just like everything was kind of bathed in, kind of a weird gray, it's a green color, but now they have the fact that you can see, various types of outlines around people, track, trails of trails of ammunition, like what I said during like military um, maneuvers. Maybe you want to be able to see, like say, be able to better see contrails off of a jet, that just flew over. So you kind of want to make sure that if you do have such a power to actually control everything, you do, they said you want to make sure you do kind of have that filter, almost kind of like the character Seymour from Teen Titans. Looks like he was actually able to just adjust, what his head said, so to see whatever he needed to when he needed. So that's definitely an interesting thing. And then if you're also talking about the idea of creating shields, well, that's just essentially making basically the light gel um, over its head again and again in such a way that it does give off quite a bit of a brightness because there are possibly so many layers, and just the fact that it is definitely strong, like how spider silk can actually be pretty, let's say, pretty durable. Yet it's only, let's say, hard. It looks like it would hardly be much of anything in the air. and yet it's able to trap pretty powerful birds, other insects, and if you've ever seen one, it allows for spiders to go ballooning, which is how they fly. But yet it's like you wouldn't even know about it, just as in this case with magicians. If they try to make things float, they're actually using a very thin piece of nylon that, unless the light catches it at a very specific point, you wouldn't know it was there. I said, unless it somehow caught on something. So in theory, is that that's all it really is, using. You're basically creating a perfect, area for everything to be bound, and you can use it for whatever you need. So take all that into consideration, and I'll see you in the next video. We're talking about interesting psychic powers. All right, have a good one.